Imagine watching your best mate get shot out of the sky not in battle, but while helplessly parachuting to the ground. That was the moment Clive Caldwell, an Aussie flying with the British RAF, snapped. From that day on, every German pilot floating down in a chute became a marked man. What followed was a ruthless, controversial campaign of revenge that would earn Clive the chilling nickname Killer. In this story, we dive into how one man's grief turned into a deadly vendetta in the skies of North Africa and how it nearly brought him face to face with one of Germany's top aces. Clive Caldwell never planned to become one of Australia's most lethal pilots. Born in Sydney in 1911, he grew up with the easygoing confidence typical of many Aussies, but like many young men of his generation, Clive's life took a hard turn when war erupted in Europe in 19. Still tethered to the British Empire, answered the call almost immediately. Clive, already in his late 20s, older than many new recruits, joined the Royal Australian Air Force with one goal: to prove himself in the fight against fascism. Soon enough, Clive found himself shipped across the world to train with the British Royal Air Force. The Desert War in North Africa was raging. Hitler's Luftwaffe and Mussolini's Italian Air Force were pounding British positions across the Mediterranean, and Churchill needed pilots fast. The RAF was pulling in men from across the Commonwealth: New Zealanders, Canadians, South Africans, and Australians like Clive, throwing them into the furnace with barely enough training to stay alive. Clive was assigned to one of the very first squadrons equipped with the new American-made P-40 Tomahawk. Sleek, fast, and more robust than the older Hurricanes, the Tomahawk promised to be a game-changer in the Desert War. But mastering it wasn't simple. Clive quickly realized that despite the aircraft's ruggedness, simply flying wasn't enough. To survive, you had to become a marksman, a killer, and gunnery was his weak spot. Unlike dogfights over the green fields of Europe, combat in North Africa played out over endless seas of sand and bright blue skies. Visibility was often perfect. There was nowhere to hide. Pilots had to master the art of deflection shooting, leading their target by the exact angle and distance so bullets would meet the enemy plane in the sky. But Clive struggled with this at first. His bursts often missed or went wide, spraying harmlessly past enemy men. Frustrated, Clive began experimenting on his own time. He realized that the shadow of his plane on the desert floor moved exactly as he did in the sky. So he practiced shadow shooting, diving and swooping while firing at his own shadow. It was unorthodox, and some of his mates teased him for it, but it worked. His accuracy improved dramatically. Before long, he was sharing the technique with others in the squadron. Eventually, this shadow shooting method was adopted by the entire Desert Air Force, transforming the way pilots trained in the sandblasted airstrips of Egypt and Libya. As Clive adapted, so did his confidence. He was older than most of the new pilots, but that gave him a calm steadiness. He wasn't reckless, but once he fired, he was relentless. He earned a quiet respect from the Brits in his unit, who at first viewed the Australians as brash colonials with too much swagger. Clive showed them that under the laid-back Aussie humor was deadly skill and iron focus. By the time 1941 rolled around, Clive Caldwell had begun to rack up kills in the sky. Each dogfight was a savage test of nerves, skill, and instinct. Every morning, pilots took off into the blistering sun knowing they might never come back. The Tomahawk's cockpit grew stifling hot, sand blasted through every seam, and the enemy was always out there waiting. But Clive seemed to thrive in the chaos. His transformation from hesitant marksman to deadly fighter was underway, setting the stage for the moment that would change him forever. The day he watched his friend Donald Munro die. That day, the calm Aussie pilot would become something much darker. Clive Caldwell's journey from awkward marksman to fearsome ace wasn't an overnight transformation. It was a grind of trial, error, and relentless self. In those early desert months, the biggest challenge every pilot faced wasn't the brutal heat or mechanical failures. It was hitting the enemy. Many were shot down before they even figured out how to land a bullet on a moving target at hundreds of miles per hour. The standard RAF training on deflection shooting was brief, theoretical, and often felt disconnected from the chaos of real dog. Instructors would scribble angles on chalkboards and toss out numbers, but when you were upside down in a screaming dive, none of that stayed in your head. Because in air combat you didn't get second chances. But Clive shrugged them off. He knew the desert was the best classroom he had. Slowly, the teasing turned to curiosity as Clive's success rate in real combat started to climb. He needed something he could feel and repeat, something that would train his instincts. Instead, Clive was scoring solid hits in dogfights, often downing enemy fighters before they even realized they were under attack. What started as Clive's solo experiments became part of the informal training doctrine. Unlike Europe, there were no forests, no cloud cover, nowhere to hide. Clive wasn't flashy, but he was methodical, and methodical men survived. And surviving meant one more experienced pilot in the air tomorrow, when the Germans would come again. And maneuvers with his ground crew, studying bullet holes in returning aircraft to figure out where his shots landed. He was also becoming something else. Harder, more ruthless, and more aware of the thin line between survival and death. Each successful fight honed him, preparing him for the day when the war would stop being just about victory, and start being about something far more personal, a raw, burning need for revenge. He became obsessed not with the glory of kills, but with the craft of them, turning the deadly art of air combat into a personal science. Every pilot had to become an expert at open sky fighting, and Clive's innovation fit perfectly with the conditions. Rookie pilots would be told, "Watch Caldwell, see how he uses the shadow to build instinct, see how he hits targets from impossible angles." His technique, so simple it almost seemed foolish, caught the attention of his squadron leaders. Soon, other pilots began copying him, practicing with their own shadows in the blinding desert sun. That's when he stumbled on what would later be called shadow shooting. In the sky, he spoke little over the radio, focusing instead on the rhythms of attack. Get above the enemy, pick a target, close in, fire short, controlled bursts, break off, and repeat. Other pilots noted that he rarely panicked. If he had a weakness, it wasn't for it, was that once he locked onto an enemy, he wouldn't stop until either he or his target went down. Miss Wanza and the German or Italian pilot you were chasing would likely turn the tables on you. As he practiced maneuvers, banking and diving, he watched the shadow twist and roll beneath him. At first, the shots were wide, the trails of dust behind his shadow missing by yards. But Clive was patient. Day after day, he took practice flights, refining his timing and adjusting his aim. He began to develop muscle memory, training his brain to judge the distance, speed, and lead needed to land his shots. And an idea struck: if he could line up and shoot his own shadow, practice leading it, predicting where it would be, he could train his eyes and hands to work together naturally. Most new pilots learn this the hard way. Clive, practical and stubborn by nature, wasn't satisfied with book learning. Flying out over the endless sand dunes, Clive noticed how the harsh African sun cast a perfect silhouette of his P-40 Tomahawk on the desert floor. He started with low-level runs, peppering the sand around his plane's shadow with short bursts from the Tomahawk's machine guns. Word got around the squadron. At first, some of the younger pilots teased him, saying he was wasting ammo or playing games with the desert floor. By late 1941, he was no longer the hesitant shooter missing easy kills. The Desert Air Force, always on the lookout for any edge, began to formalize the method. The method worked especially well in North Africa, where the ground was flat and empty. Meanwhile, Clive kept pushing himself. He analyzed every dogfight he survived, talking through the angles. Clive also began to build a reputation for calm under pressure. This single-minded focus earned him grudging respect from the British officers, who had initially viewed the Australians as undisciplined and loud. By the end of the year, Clive was becoming more than just another Commonwealth pilot. He was quietly emerging as one of the Desert Air Force's most reliable killers, and that day was coming fast. July 4th, 1941, started like any other blistering day in the desert. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Clive Caldwell's squadron began prepping their P-40 Tomahawks for another sortie. The sand was already hot enough to burn through boot soles, and the thin desert air shimmered with heat. Clive checked over his aircraft methodically, running a hand along the wings, feeling every rivet and panel like he was greeting an old friend. Beside him, his close mate, Donna Munro, was doing the same with his own plane, trading casual banter with the ground crew. Munro had been Clive's wingman for months, cheerful Aussie, with a knack for bad jokes and a fearless streak that sometimes bordered on reckless. The two men trusted each other completely. In the chaos of a dogfight, trust wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The briefing that morning was simple. German fighters had been spotted escorting bombers heading toward a British supply convoy south of Mersa. The squadron was ordered to intercept, break them up, and keep the supply lines clear. They'd done it a dozen times before, and though the work was dangerous, there was a confidence in the air. They were ready. By mid-morning, Clive and Munro were airborne, climbing through the hot sky toward a column of dark specks on the horizon. As they approached, the specks resolved into enemy bombers. Flanked by sleek German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, almost immediately, the radio chatter exploded with warnings, curses, and frantic calls for cover. The Germans had spotted them. The sky turned into chaos. Planes dove, twisted, and roared past each other, tracers slicing bright lines through the pale blue. Clive and Munro stayed tight, maneuvering through the fight with practiced precision. Clive spotted a German fighter diving on Munro's tail and shouted into the radio. Munro banked hard. Clive slid in behind the German and fired. The Messerschmitt rolled away, smoking. For a few brief moments, the two Aussies found themselves in the clear. Clive looked over and caught Munro's grin through the canopy. They were alive, and they were winning. But in the next instant, everything changed. A second pair of German fighters dropped out of the sun, unseen until it was too late. One latched onto Munro's 6 o'clock and fired a savage burst. Munro's plane bucked and shuddered, smoke pouring from the engine. Clive screamed into the radio, but there was nothing he could do. He watched in horror as Munro's plane began to burn, the canopy jettisoning as his friend bailed out into the open sky. Munro's parachute bloomed a fragile white dot against the endless sand. Clive pulled his tomahawk around, hunting for the German that had hit him, but in the chaos he couldn't spot the bastard. Then, over his shoulder, he saw it. Another German fighter swinging back toward Munro's drifting parachute. What happened next felt like it unfolded in slow motion. The German lined up on the helpless parachute and opened fire. The white silk shuddered, ripped, and then collapsed. Clive watched, powerless, as Munro's body dropped like a stone into the desert below. Something inside Clive snapped. He wasn't a soft man. War had already hardened him, but this was different. Shooting a helpless man as he drifted to earth wasn't combat, it was murder. And in that searing instant, the easygoing Australian, the man who had quietly built his skill and reputation through methodical practice, became something else entirely. He yanked his tomahawk around, ignoring the radio chatter screaming in his ears. The German that had killed Munro was gone, but it didn't matter. Every German in the sky became the enemy. Clive dove on the nearest Messerschmitt, fired a long burst, and watched it tumble into flames. His shots were precise, cold, and deadly. For the rest of the fight, Clive flew with a singular fury, cutting through the enemy ranks with ruthless efficiency. He took hits, came close to stalling, but kept coming back, firing again and again. His fellow pilots would later say they'd never seen him fly like that, like a man possessed. When the battle finally ended, Clive limped back to base with his plane riddled with bullet holes. He landed, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked straight past the cheering ground crew. There was no victory in him, only a hollow rage. He didn't speak about Munro. He barely slept that night, and the next morning he was back in the air. From that day forward, Clive Caldwell carried Munro's death with him into every fight. But it wasn't grief that guided him, it was a cold, burning desire for revenge. He decided that any German pilot who floated down in a parachute after a fight would get no mercy. The Germans had shown him there was no honor in this war, and he would return that ruthlessness tenfold. It was a grim transformation. Some of his squadron mates noticed the change, whispering that Clive had become hard and unforgiving. Others quietly supported him. After all, the Germans had started it. War had stripped away the rules, and Clive was simply playing by the new ones. The name Killer Caldwell would come later, whispered first in the tents and mess halls of the desert, then passed around like legend. But it all started here, on July 4th, 1941, under the blinding African sun, when Clive watched his friend murdered in cold blood. In that moment, Clive learned a brutal lesson that would define the rest of his war. The sky held no mercy on, neither would he. The death of Donald Munro on July 4th, 1941, was the final crack in Clive Caldwell's carefully built shell of discipline and restraint. He had always been a methodical pilot, focused on skill, precision, and craft. But in the brutal sun-soaked desert of North Africa, grief didn't stay soft for long. It calcified into rage, and for Clive, that rage took one simple, deadly form. If the Germans were willing to shoot men floating helplessly to earth, then so was he. At first, no one quite believed the rumors. In the RAF there was an unspoken rule. You didn't shoot parachuting enemy pilots. Killing them in the air was war. Gunning them down while they drifted defenseless was seen as murder. It wasn't a written law, but it was tradition, built on a fragile sense of mutual respect among pilots who all knew they could be the ones hanging helpless in a chute next. But Clive had watched that respect burn with Munro's broken body in the sand. In interviews after the war, he claimed he felt no guilt about parachuting enemy pilots. He argued that those men would be back in the air the next day, killing his mates. The grief and anger never left him, but he didn't let them cloud his judgment in the cockpit. Instead, he channeled them into an ice-cold focus that made him one of the most effective pilots in the Desert Air Force. It was simple, arithmetic. Kill them now, protect your own tomorrow. Clive carried a mental ledger of every friend he lost in the desert, In rare, quiet hours, Clive was known to sit by the edge of the airfield, staring out at the dunes, lost in thought. Sometimes, younger pilots would find him and sit beside him, looking for wisdom. His kill tally began to rival some of the best in the Desert Air Force. But a man whose method sometimes strained the thin veneer of gentleman's war the RAF still liked to believe existed. But in the desert, where life and death came down to split-second choices, that veneer had long since vanished. Clive wasn't a monster. He was a product of a war that had shown him there was no honor, only survival. He was credited with 28.5 confirmed victories, a number that put him among the top Commonwealth aces of the entire war. He was a soldier, and in his mind, the enemy had set the rules when they murdered Donald Monroe. All he did was play by them. He earned the respect of his commanders and the quiet awe of his peers. Even as the controversy around his parachute shootings continued to swirl, Clive would give them practical tips: how to aim, how to conserve fuel, how to trust their gut when a split-second decision meant life or death. He watched men he'd eaten breakfast with go up in flames by lunch, and while the grief never softened, it did change him into something almost machine-like. He didn't celebrate kills. He didn't toast victories. He rarely smiled. His mission was simple: destroy as many enemy planes as possible and keep his mates alive. So when the opportunity came, Clive took his revenge. His name would be whispered by German pilots over crackling radios, spoken with wary respect by his mates, and written into the brutal history of air combat over North Africa. Some older British pilots found it distasteful, muttering in a mess tent that it would come back to haunt them if the Germans started doing the same. But others, particularly the younger Commonwealth pilots hardened by desert warfare, quietly admired Clive's ruthlessness. He drilled himself relentlessly, and he pushed his squadron mates to do the same. In briefings he spoke little, but when he did, men listened. He taught them the art of desert flying: stay low when you needed cover, climb high when you wanted the advantage, never linger too long on a target, and above all, never assume an enemy was out of the fight until you saw them crash or burn. In the unforgiving skies of North Africa, sentimentality got you killed, and Clive Caldwell didn't plan on dying anytime soon. In his next few engagements, whenever he saw an enemy pilot bail out, Clive dove on them, riddling the white silk canopy with bullets. The first time he did it, there was a stunned silence over the radio. Ground crews talked about Clive returning from sorties with an eerie calm, his guns blackened with powder residue. He often flew multiple sorties a day, returning with bullet holes stitched across his wings, sometimes with engine oil dripping from a wounded plane, but always returning. Ground crews began to say that Clive's plane was charmed, that somehow he always managed to limp back no matter how bad the damage. Fellow pilots, especially the newer ones, began to look at him differently. Part fear, some called him. Others whispered that he was exactly what the squadron needed in this savage war. Some pilots barked in shock, others muttered approval. But Clive didn't say a word. He simply moved on to the next target. Word spread quickly through Luftwaffe channels that there was an Australian in the P-40 squadrons who showed no mercy, a pilot who would keep firing even as you floated to the ground. German intelligence intercepts later confirmed that some enemy units explicitly warned their men about Caldwell, calling him the killer from the desert. It wasn't long before the stories began to circulate. The German pilots came to fear him too. That reputation earned him his nickname among both friend and foe: Killer Caldwell. Clive didn't revel in the moniker, but he didn't reject it either. His attitude was controversial even within his own squadron. But Clive's new edge wasn't just about killing parachuting pilots. It was about how he flew, how he fought, and how he carried himself back at base. He studied every engagement with the same obsessive attention he'd once devoted to shadow shooting. This ruthless efficiency led to results. Clive's kill count began to climb steadily, but behind the stoic exterior, the cost was piling up. Still, there were moments that showed the man beneath the killer. Then he'd stand, light a cigarette, and walk back to his plane ready to fly again. Over time, Clive's reputation grew beyond just his squadron. To the British High Command, Caldwell was a double-edged sword, a brilliant fighter and leader. Clive himself never softened or recanted. He didn't see himself as a hero or a villain. By the end of 1941, Clive "Killer" Caldwell was not just a pilot, he was a symbol of the desert war itself, sun-baked, scarred by grief, and fueled by a stubborn will to survive. And though the war still had years left to run, Clive had already transformed into something the Germans feared most, a man who would not stop until he had paid his debt of blood. After the day he watched Donald Monroe murdered in the sky, Clive Caldwell changed the way he flew and the way he fought. He became a man driven by numbers, measuring every day by the number of enemy planes he destroyed, the number of friends he kept alive, and the number of bullet holes in his own battered Tomahawk. And that obsession led him to rack up an incredible tally of victories in the sky, him from a solid pilot into one of the most feared aces in the entire Desert Air Force. Throughout late 1941 and into 1942, Clive's name became synonymous with deadly precision. His kill count grew steadily, reaching into the double digits by early night. He often flew multiple sorties a day, sometimes landing to refuel and rearm before immediately taking off again into the shimmering desert heat. While other pilots took quick breaks to gulp down tea or catch a moment's rest, Clive stayed focused, studying maps, reviewing tactics, and conferring with mechanics to squeeze every ounce of performance out of his machine. One of the defining moments of Clive's career came on a blistering afternoon in early 1942. Reports had come in of a large German fighter sweep moving to strike British ground positions near the front. Clive scrambled with his squadron, climbing into the sky with the sun at his back. What followed was one of the fiercest air battles the desert would see, and a day Clive achieved the legendary status of Ace in a day. Over the course of a single brutal engagement, Clive shot down 5 enemy aircraft. He dove and fired with the cold calm that had become his signature, often closing in so close that oil and debris from enemy planes splattered his windscreen. His bursts were short, controlled, devastating, just as he had practiced firing at his own shadow so many months before. When the fight ended, Clive returned to base with a plane riddled with holes, the engines coughing and sputtering, but still flying, and on his face was the same hard stare he'd worn since the day Monroe died. No victory cheers, no relief, just the tight set of a man who had unfinished business. His squadron cheered him, of course, and news of his feat spread quickly through the Desert Air Force and even back to Britain. Ace in a day was a title few pilots ever achieved, and for a short while, Clive Caldwell became a kind of living legend, a symbol of Commonwealth grit and skill. Newspapers back home hailed him as a hero, calling him the Red Desert Ace, splashing his face on front pages and filling columns with stories of his exploits. But Clive never seemed to care about the headlines. For him, the war wasn't about glory, it was about retribution and survival. The more Germans he killed, the fewer men like Donald Monroe would die helpless in the sand. Clive's rising fame also brought him closer to facing some of the Luftwaffe's top aces-men with reputations as fearsome as his own. Among them was Lieutenant Werner Schröer, one of Germany's best pilots in North Africa. Schröer was a master tactician, credited with dozens of kills, and known for his cool, analytical flying style. Rumor had it Schröer studied the combat reports of every Commonwealth ace he might face, preparing traps and baiting them into fatal mistakes. Clive first crossed paths with Schröer in a massive air battle over Elam. The two never officially met in person, but they danced across the same patch of sky, dueling in the chaotic swirl of P-40s and Bf-109s. In that fight, Clive nearly had Schröer in his sights. He dove on the German ace from above, his finger squeezing the trigger just as Schröer rolled away at the last second. The burst of fire missed by inches, and Schröer vanished into the chaos, only to reappear moments later on another Commonwealth pilot's tail. Clive pursued him, determined to finish the job, but Schröer's skill was undeniable. He weaved, climbed, and dove with surgical precision, refusing to give Clive the clean shot he wanted. Eventually, Clive had to break off, low on fuel and ammunition, cursing over the radio. It was the closest he would come to ending one of Germany's greatest threats in the desert and near brush, with a man who would go on to become one of the Luftwaffe's top-scoring aces. Though Clive didn't shoot Schröer down that day, the encounter left a mark on him. He respected Schröer's skill, but it also fueled his determination. He redoubled his efforts, pushing himself and his squadron harder, determined to keep the German aces from gaining any advantage in the air war. As Clive's legend grew, so did the myths. Stories circulated that he couldn't be shot down, that his plane had some magical charm, that he could smell Germans in the sky before he even saw them. Ground crews swore his Tomahawk practically repaired itself overnight. Young pilots idolized him, trying to mimic his icy radio discipline and tight, deadly attack runs. But not all the stories were flattering. Some whispered about the parachute killings, about how Clive never gave the enemy a chance to surrender. Others muttered that he was cold, even ruthless, with little sympathy left in him after so many kills and so many funerals. The nickname Killer Caldwell was both praise and accusation, a testament to his skill, and a dark hint of the brutality that lay beneath the surface. Yet even Clive's harshest critics admitted one thing: he got results. Under his leadership and influence, the RAF and Commonwealth squadrons in North Africa began to claw back air superiority from the Luftwaffe. By mid-1942, The tide of the Desert War was shifting. Every German plane Clive shot down was one less threat to British ground forces, one less predator hunting his fellow pilots. Through it all, Clive stayed much the same. He flew, he fought, he studied, and he killed. And each time he pulled the trigger, he remembered Donald Munro, remembered the white canopy shredding under enemy gunfire, the helpless figure dropping into the sand. It wasn't about medals, or headlines, or even revenge anymore. It was about finishing what he'd started, about paying the blood debt the desert had demanded from him. The war still had more battles ahead, and Clive Caldwell would be there for all of them. His finger steady on the trigger, his eyes scanning the sky for the next target. And the Germans knew it too whenever they took off over North Africa. They wondered if today would be the day they crossed paths with the Australian ace known simply as Killer, because if they did, there was no mercy waiting for them in that blazing desert sky, only the cold, steady hands of a man who had turned vengeance into an art. By the end of the North African campaign, Clive Caldwell had cemented himself as Australia's top-scoring fighter ace. His confirmed tally, 28.5 kills, placed him among the deadliest pilots in the entire war. But behind the raw numbers lay a legacy tangled with controversy, haunted by the harsh choices he made in the heat of battle. In the RAF records and Australian military annals, Caldwell's skills were undeniable. He helped develop tactics, trained dozens of pilots who would go on to become aces themselves. The rumors of shooting enemy pilots in parachutes followed Caldwell wherever he went. Though never officially charged or reprimanded, some higher-ups quietly frowned on his tactics. Friends said he never truly let go of what happened to Donald Munro, though he continued to serve, eventually leading training squadrons and helping develop post-warrior doctrine. He never returned to combat with the same fire. In interviews, he spoke less about his victories and more about the men he lost. He rarely smiled when talking about the war, and never sugarcoated the reality of what he'd done. Within the RAF, opinions were split. Some officers believed Clive had crossed a line that should never be crossed. That chivalry, however tattered, was still worth preserving in the savage world of air combat, or did it stain the soul of the man who carried it out? Some argue he was a necessary figure in a brutal theater of war, an ace who fought the way the desert demanded. Was he a hero or a killer, a savior or a symptom of the madness of war? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Clive never seemed to care what people called him. He had done what he believed was necessary. He had fought his war his way, and when the desert finally went quiet, he walked away forever changed by the weight of revenge, and by the ghosts he carried with him from the bright, burning skies over North Africa. Others say his story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even heroes can cross moral lines that leave lasting questions behind. Though remembered for his daring feats in the sky, it's the darker edge of his story that lingers, a man broken by grief, flying with ghosts. If you found the story gripping, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Was Clive a hero, or something else entirely? Others argue that war had no room for sentiment, especially when the enemy showed none themselves. He brought a cold efficiency to air combat, stripping away the last illusions of knightly chivalry that had clung to the idea of the fighter pilot since World War I in the place of old traditions. He left a raw, unsparing reality. That war was not about honor, it was about killing, surviving, and coming home to tell the tale, and played a crucial role in turning the tide of the air war in North Africa. He insisted he had no pity for pilots who had just tried to kill him and his mates. In his eyes, letting them float to safety only guaranteed they'd be back in the sky, hunting more Allied airmen the next day. His justification was brutally simple. This wasn't a game. This was survival. His innovations, especially shadow shooting, continued to influence gunnery training long after the war. Historians credit him with saving countless Allied lives by aggressively breaking German air superiority at a time when RAF's forces threatened to crush the British in Egypt. But there was always the shadow of what he had done and what he had become. For Clive, there was never any regret. After the war, when journalists asked him about his reputation, he was blunt. Back home in Australia, public sentiment was complicated. Some newspapers praised him as a hero who fought dirty when the enemy had shown their true colors. Others, particularly after the war, questioned whether revenge had hardened him into something darker. A few veterans spoke out, arguing that Caldwell embodied the harsh, unforgiving truth of modern warfare, a reality where chivalry died the moment someone shot your friend out of a parachute. For Caldwell himself, the war left deep scars. Later in life, Caldwell's story was revisited by historians who wrestled with the question that still hangs over so many warriors. Did vengeance save lives? One thing remains clear. Clive Killer Caldwell changed the way pilots fought over North Africa. To this day, historians and aviation enthusiasts debate his legacy. Clive Caldwell didn't set out to be a killer, he set out to serve. But war has a way of reshaping men, and for Clive, vengeance became his fuel.